This conference will now be recorded.
All right, well, it is 2 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Again, for those of you that have just joined, my name is Liz Hess. I'm the host of the KEMA Coffee Breaks. So we're going to get started with today's session, which is on crisis communications, and we have some great speakers. It's going to be kind of back and forth and open for discussion. So please feel free to use the comment section, and the instructions are on the screen there. I'll leave that up for a few more minutes. So if this is your first time at a KEMA Coffee Break, welcome. Thanks for joining us. We're really excited for today's topic of crisis communications. We started this essentially over lockdown as a way to keep the momentum of emergency preparedness going. So we're trying for the most part to do these on a monthly basis and invite speakers from the field of emergency management to talk on what interests them and based on the topic. So we're always looking for topic ideas, so feel free to shoot me an email with any suggestions of topics or if you'd be interested in speaking at one of these in the future. Again, we're going to keep this kind of free-flowing, so feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions throughout. And if it's appropriate to the discussion, we'll certainly answer them best we can. So I'm going to let the two speakers, Oliver and Ashley, introduce themselves because they know themselves best. So Oliver, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Liz. Really happy to have the opportunity to address folks as part of this KEMA Coffee Break today. I run a company called C4CS. We've been around for more than 20 years, have multiple offices in the US, representation in Europe. And we specialize and have specialized from day one in strategic communication and crisis management. And where those two areas overlap, we find what is commonly referred to as crisis communication. I hail from Europe and have lived in this country for I said it earlier, I formed the company some 20 plus years ago, have lived in other countries prior to that, but I have a slightly different perspective than those who have practiced the craft only in North America, as my company serves clients across the globe with an emphasis on North America, but there are also clients in Europe as well as in Asia primarily. And again, very happy to be speaking today. I in particular look forward to the Q&A session later as we huddled leading up to this event. Ashley, Liz, and I were talking how can we do this, and in particular the back and forth as far as Q&A is probably going to be pretty interesting for me too.
Yes, thank you, Oliver. Very excited to have you. All right, Ashley, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you for having me. My name is Ashley Morris. I'm currently the Community Engagement Specialist at Fairfax County Office of Emergency Management. So my role with Fairfax County is all communications. Most of that's preparedness and outreach through our programs that we have, but a lot of it's social media. So I manage our OEM social media account. We're constantly pumping preparedness messaging, but also COVID-19 messaging, incident messaging, severe weather messaging, any other disaster that could come upon us during 2020, that would be going out with social media. I also am active in volunteer management and volunteer communications with Fairfax as well. At prior roles out in Texas, I was emergency management specialist for Williamson County, as well as emergency management planner for the city of Leander. I did social media in both of those positions as well, and I actually worked really closely with the county and city PIO because from the beginning of me entering the field, social media, messaging, severe weather communication has always been one of my priorities and one of those passions of mine. So I'm so excited to be here to talk about social media, but also how we can do a better job communicating to the public, because I actually think that public communication is the key to getting people to do what we want them to do during disasters, but also to effective incident response.
Wonderful, thank you. So as you folks can hear, we kind of have two unique perspectives. We have Ashley coming from more the local response expertise, and then Oliver kind of more the strategic crisis communications with businesses and so forth. So they'll kind of speak to their own experience and then hopefully give you a more holistic view of crisis communication and be able to take something from this today, because that's always the goal. So we're going to start, Oliver, with you. Could you just kind of go over what are the key components or the pillars of crisis communication?
Sure, Ashley and Liz. I wanted to throw out two that I have presented at KEMA conferences in the past, and I have been to more conferences than just the ones that I have presented at, and have always enjoyed the conversations with people that work across the spectrum of emergency management, organizational resilience, whatever term you might want to use there. The work, and Liz just said that I do predominantly happens within the area of the corporate world, if you will. We've done quite a bit of work with federal agencies, however, including U.S. Forest Service, ATF, and so forth. And however, as just stated, my primary expertise probably has to do more with the corporate world, and as such, it's a little bit with that focus on corporate, difficult to cover everything. But I would certainly want to say that when we're talking about crisis communication, there are a couple of things that are true for municipalities, for emergency management departments, as well as for any corporation out there, whether it's a nonprofit organization, for-profit, privately owned, or publicly listed as in company-owned shares. First of all, and this is something that my company, my colleagues and I typically refer to as our communication laws, if you will. We want to have any communication that transpires during time of crisis to be timely, truthful, consistent, and coordinated. It's those four crisis communication tenets, if you will. And let me go through those real quick. We want to be timely, as in when we have a crisis event, an incident of whatever sort. It could certainly be a flooding, a wildfire, you name it. And there's the whole gamut of corporate crises where you may venture into sexual harassment and fraud and all kinds of different scenarios. But to concentrate a little more on an incident along the lines of either an industrial accident or a fire, a hurricane ripping through an area, you would want to always be timely in terms of your response, number one. That means you have to be ready well before something actually happens. We're probably going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about the preparedness angle, the preparation side of things. I mentioned the term organizational readiness earlier. Having worked in crisis management for 25 years and counting, as well as in that area of strategic communication where crisis communication is housed, well, I can only emphasize that the timeliness is very critical. Give you an example. If we have an event along the lines of a fire, you would want to be in touch as soon as possible, in addition to the initial notification, churning out messages regarding any kind of evacuation that needs to happen, any kind of sheltering in place that needs to happen. And all of this is essentially based upon an effective communication response. You can do everything right from a managerial point of view, which is the decision making, as well as from an operational point of view, which in our world would be the activities that you mount in order to respond to whatever type of scenario is unfolding. But if you do not communicate, then your response will falter. And that's why crisis communication is really critical. And in addition to it having to be timely, it certainly needs to be truthful. That is based upon what you have available as far as factual information concerning a given incident, a given crisis is concerned, needs to be communicated in a way so that it is easily to understand, in a way so that it captures all of the facts that are currently available. And we never have a problem when a client talks to us and says, hey, here's something that we feel uncomfortable divulging at this point. It may be health-related information, could be information that, according to law, cannot be disseminated. Then that's certainly okay. But by and large, you want to be truthful. And the third item that I mentioned earlier is you want to be consistent, as in you do want to sing from the same song sheet. If you have multiple PIOs, public information officers, or spokespersons in the corporate world, then all of these folks need to be on the same page and need to utilize the same messages, ideally down to the particular wording that they use as they address stakeholders, internal as well as external. When we talk about spokespersons, PIOs, people usually probably associate with that primarily, yes, there's somebody who talks to the media. But let's just take a broader view here. Any communication that happens with, for instance, employees on the internal end, on the external end, with law enforcement representatives, there may be regulators involved, a larger number of stakeholders is probably something that we all can come up with related to whatever crisis it may be. And those groups of people need to be addressed appropriately. Certainly your message can be altered in order to hit a home run with this particular stakeholder group. Somebody who is not in the field may not know regarding, for instance, certain terminology. So you want to stay away from acronyms and fancy wording that will not be understood by the general public out there. But this is sort of the minute details that you then need to massage in order to make that work for the particular audience / stakeholder group that you're talking to. Outside of that, see to it that the messages are consistent, and lastly, they need to be coordinated. And again, that goes back to what we refer to as a one-voice policy, which extends the actual messages to the coordination, for instance, regarding a timeline. So it's a good thing as you are mounting your response to whatever event it may be, to actually develop a timeline. Okay, at these points in time, we're going to come out with new information. We will be in touch with reporters. We will be in touch with our employees, in touch with different audiences and stakeholder groups. And the better you can align that at the outset of a crisis and then make changes to it as you go through the crisis response, the more beneficial it's going to be for you. Bottom line, really, if an organization of whatever kind happens to handle the managerial and operational details of a crisis well, but then ineffectively communicates with internal and external stakeholders, it is quite possible, and has happened a lot, I can attest to that, that the entire crisis response is going to suffer and potentially simply fail. So that's another pillar, and there's something else to remember, of course. That botched communication response will obviously lead not only to increased traditional and social media coverage and scrutiny coming from various stakeholders, but it can have a lasting effect. So it's not just not being able to handle this particular crisis and then that's it. No, you will potentially have long-term problems with your reputation, hit it on your bottom line. It can be for municipalities, emergency management teams and departments, very important. It can mean a loss of trust, and that's what we want to avoid. We want our stakeholders to trust in the messages that we put out. If there's a loss of trust because we have not been factual in the past, or we have overstated, exaggerated things that were later massively corrected, then that's not good for us. We have already had Ashley speak to the fact that social media is very important. I want to put an exclamation mark behind that. We've seen a huge shift. Working in the early 1990s in this field was a completely different thing compared to now, because, well, email had already arrived on our doorstep, but the concept of social media was simply not existent at that time. So since the arrival of social media, everything has basically changed. We need to embrace social media and at the same time understand that there are not only advantages to it. We now can churn out information potentially quicker, potentially be more targeted, reaching certain stakeholder groups, but there are also downsides. I'm sure Ashley's going to shed more light on these. So it all comes down to preparation. You need to address internal as well as external stakeholders, as already stated, and the preparation will, at the end of the day, definitely yield benefits. If you do not have at this time, as your agency, as your setup for EMS, whatever it may be, a hospital system, a university, and we've done work in these sectors as well quite a bit. If you do not yet have a crisis communication plan, if you do not have designated spokespersons or PIOs, then yesterday is the time to have tackled it. That's kind of what it boils down to. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. So essentially timely, truthful, consistent, and coordinated. Ashley, I assume you would echo that in your side. So Ashley, from your perspective, how do you then take all that and start the communicating with externals and stakeholders, the planning for all of that?
Yeah, so in emergency management, we're very familiar with the importance of preparedness and planning, not only for our community, but for us as emergency managers. And so part of having a successful communication strategy is actually getting in a room like we do with all of our other emergency plans and coming up with a communication strategy. So how are you going to be timely? What methods are you going to use to release timely information? How are you going to do truthful information? Who's going to approve the messages that are going out? A really big deal for us is we work with a lot of different agencies. We do a lot of different disasters and incidents. Who is the lead on those disasters or those incidents? For instance, the fire department might be the lead agency on one, the police department might be the other. It's important to have those conversations now and know who is leading the message. So that way, when we're amplifying that message, we know who we're trying to pass off to. And all of that is constructed in a plan, sitting around a table, working with each other. A really big part of the planning process also is looking at our community. So a lot of our messaging actually goes out to the public, and you cannot do an effective job of public communication or messaging if you don't know who your public is. So I encourage, just like we do hazard assessment for our jurisdictions, to do a community assessment. What's the makeup in your community? What languages are in your community? What about accessibility? How are you going to provide accessible messaging for people who cannot see, cannot hear? That's extremely important too for digital media, which we'll talk about later. Kind of doing that assessment and incorporating that in your communication strategy and plan is important. And then actually putting together that document. Many of us have emergency plan annexes for like alert and warning as a part of our emergency operations plan. So making sure that that's up to date. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with having other different plans on a department level or on a city level. One plan that I actually created at Leander was a script plan. So once again, looking at my community, looking at the incidents that we could have, looking at our messaging and our ability to send WIAs and things like that, sitting down in a room, putting those scripts on paper, preloading all that messaging. So I really do think that having these conversations beforehand is kind of the key to success in our field. And I encourage all of those relationships to be built and all of those discussions to be had before you get the call about the disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, yeah. Ashley, can you identify some stakeholders that you've had in that planning process that people might not think of?
Yeah, so I kind of gave a little background. So I've always been doing emergency management communication. And so I've never actually been the technical city or county PIO. And so it is essential to work with your city or county PIO if you're blessed to have one. Obviously, it is their slice of cake and they are the expert. And they also have a lot of great relationships with the media and with other strategy. And so I would always have my PIO at the table, and we would have a very close relationship in talking about messaging, not only from the Office of Emergency Management, but from the city, so that we were coordinating. And then we would also bring in the other agencies. And so fire, we were never lucky enough to have a fire PIO at the places that I was at. So it would be your fire chief or whoever would be in charge of being tasked of that information release. He would be in the room. Same with police. I would have police at the table. Once again, didn't have a PIO from them, but a representative that has a say in what kind of information. A part of that too would be bringing your media in, which I kind of mentioned with PIO, but establishing those relationships, telling them what to expect. It's really good to be clear about what method you're going to release information from, because if you work with the media, you'll know that they would rather find your information to put it in an article rather than giving you a call. It takes them more time to have to reach out and tap you on the shoulder for it. And so having them in the room or even having some kind of plan involving them and building those relationships is important as well. And then any other stakeholders that you might have that might be involved in that process.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ashley. So Oliver, what can you tell us about dealing with the media, like more so traditional news outlets and print and their inquiries? How do you manage when they're asking for that information?
Sure. Yeah. Allow me to add one other point here, and this ties into media for sure. We've discussed preparedness, the readiness aspect of things. And in addition to the items that have already been mentioned, what we probably want to weave in at this point as well is, of course, that in the area of crisis communications, we also need to, as is the case in any other area when it comes to crisis management, disaster recovery, BCP, and so forth, we want to be vigilant in terms of exercising plans, procedures. And that is really that training aspect that I would like to mention at this time too, so it doesn't get neglected. And we can touch on this again later. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that media are no different in terms of working with journalists and the skills that one needs to have, and it's acquiring those skills from any other endeavor, whether it's a hobby or a profession. You do need to practice. And unless you practice, because practice is the only thing that will make you perfect or get you as close to perfect as possible, without that, it's just not going to happen. And dealing with the media in times of crisis, in terms of being available for interviews, for instance, or just interacting with them, setting up an interview opportunity or whatever else it might be for others, running a news conference, you name it, all that requires knowledge from a theoretical standpoint, and then the actual message delivery practice and experience, because somebody needs to be addressing the media. And Ashley talked about the PIOs with whom she has worked closely in the past, and I'm sure she will be working with them very closely in many years to come. But it's important for everyone to understand that, and this goes back to consistent messaging and coordinated messaging, we should always only have the PIO or designated spokesperson speak to media representatives in any interview type situation. And even outside of those types of situations, it's critical that we have only designated spokespersons or PIOs address media. We've been in a lot of situations where media are in front of the gate or in the parking lot area or another publicly accessible area, and then they do what we in the industry might refer to as an ambush interview, and all of a sudden somebody has a camera in their face, bright light, and here come the questions. And if that individual is not prepared, has not gone through any training, and by and large, the results will be not ideal. And so, again, training is key. And what we want to understand is that these areas of media relations, which is having relationships in place, which comes on the heels of building them in the first place, is really the key for setting up successful interviews for those that have been specially trained to address media representatives in those kinds of situations. And I'm not talking about the 60 minutes high stakes interview here. This can be just something that happens in the course of a minor incident. but certainly could be as a result of a hurricane, potentially any kind of natural disaster or critical event of any other kind, with possibly injuries or even fatalities. And the higher the stakes, the more inquisitive and the journalists might be, and the more scrutiny you will experience, not only from journalists, but when we're talking about media, that's really the group we want to focus on heavily. So those are things that we definitely do want to keep in mind. You know? I've done hundreds of training. Go ahead.
I was just going to go ahead and jump into that. I actually have an experience of that happening, and so the media has actually been known to DM. Or get a hold of your social media account, and they'll DM for interviews or other things. And so it's really important to make sure that your PIO is kind of your primary go-to. Anytime that I ever had any media inquiries into social media or anything else, I would always redirect them to the PIO. But it's really important to train on that, and that's all of your staff. Make sure all your staff is aware that the PIO, whether it's city, county, or even agency, is the lead for that. So if they do get a direct message from one of the news stations, they don't answer it or say, oh, I want to be on TV and take the interview. Another thing too, I always train my CERT team and my volunteers for the same thing, for exactly like what Oliver said. If they were out in the field and they had somebody come up and ask them a question about an incident that they would have been working as a volunteer responder, they were always taught to say, no, we can't release any information. It's going to come straight from the assigned PIO. And so I completely agree with what he was saying, and I've actually had that experience happen to me, and also other incidents. So people or the media will reach out to you if you're a neighbor to the incident or you're not even on the incident. And so it's just really important to keep that in mind and kind of have that pre-planning in those conversations ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sums that up nicely. I did want to mention one term that we use in the industry, and that's in addition to message delivery, I referred to that earlier, which is essentially giving the interview. There's also the message development side of things. And that's actually, it's almost a science, if you will. Clients across the board, and that could be a municipality, that could be a government agency, sometimes when they are not yet knowledgeable, let's put it that way, in terms of how the process works when you are preparing for a media interview, think that they can just sit down for 2 minutes prior to addressing a reporter and line a couple of things up in their head, and then they're going to be fine. And nothing could, unfortunately, be further from the truth. I mean, we do message development sessions that are many hours long and can, if it's a very complex matter, last a very, very long time. Obviously, in a crisis situation, we may not have any time available, and that's where it goes back to the practicing training area. In crisis communications, and I mentioned crisis communication plans earlier, we do want to have everything prepped to the degree possible. For instance, have a template available with the language already crafted for particular incidents, where you then only have to put in the specific information regarding what is currently happening. But you can draft that already, and then it will certainly have to undergo a review process. On the client side, when it comes to corporate, this will certainly also involve attorneys. We can talk about that later too. You will have that as well on the municipal side to make sure that there isn't any liability attached to what we're trying to say. But by and large, doing all this as much as you can early on in the process, long before you have an event along the lines of flood, and then everything that's outside of the realm of natural disasters too. The more time you invest up front, the better. That's certainly the case. And that's that message development component where you sit down and develop messages as a team. You pull in external resources, such as a consultant and others. Maybe you have external legal counsel and so forth. But that's definitely something that you will want to keep an eye on.
Right, yeah, I was just thinking of how many times I go to give a a talk or talk in front of clients and I have in my head what I think I'm going to say and half of it gets missed because I'm not prepared as well as I should be. So yes, it's very, very realistic scenario there. So Oliver, to kind of add to that, how do you then communicate internally with your own employees, and how does that come into play with all of this? So often I think we get focused on communicating outward and then don't tell our staff what's going on.
Right. Yeah, and that's actually a topic that's very dear to me. I've written articles, given interviews quite a bit over the years regarding this particular area of expertise, and it can be challenging. Most people that are initiated, if you will, are probably thinking when they hear about crisis communications, yes, we need to communicate, and with whom do we need to communicate? Well, obviously the media and maybe another external stakeholder group. For corporations, companies, this would certainly be the customer client side. But even nowadays in 2020, we find that internal communication sometimes is neglected or downright ignored, and that's a big problem, because if you do not have your own employees on your side, they cannot advocate on your behalf. They will not be safe potentially, which is a huge problem, obviously. And in order to do things right on the internal communication, and we can probably summarize things, I'm just going to go through a list of items in my mind that we do want to keep in mind, and folks can go to my LinkedIn profile and look up more information on that if they like, whether it's in the form of an interview or article regarding the topic. But by and large, you want to do the following. You want to make sure that you have frequent two-way communication. And that's important because as you talk to employees, you want to provide feedback options. So it has to be two-way, as in you do not just churn messages out and never find out whether those resonate with your audience, whether they understand it and act according to what you would like for them to know and to do, including employees. So you want to have opportunities built into it in regards to reaching back out to you. And there are many different ways that can be done, including in a crisis situation. You may fall back on vehicles that you already have in place, whether it's a reply email or you have a special phone number, a toll-free number created just for employees to get back to you. And again, that can certainly work for other external stakeholders as well. You do want to have and implement a customized plan specifically for your internal communication before a crisis strikes. When we review crisis communications plans, and again, this is across different sectors, oftentimes there's so much focus on the external communication, and we hardly find anything regarding having a plan in place for reaching out to internal audiences, employees, essentially. And you do need, for any kind of process that you put in place on the internal end, have and obtain senior management buy-in, as well as ongoing support. There needs to be a budget for that. There need to be tools made available. So that's another critical component of that you need to have in place. And then you obviously need to have an understanding that starts with senior leaders within the organization, whichever organization it may be. There should be an understanding that you cannot, if at all possible, have negative information or crisis-related information per se get communicated to employees after, especially the media have already heard about it. We run into situations where employees find out the next day in the newspaper that they read, mostly online these days, or on TV, evening news, morning, Today Show, whatever it may be, that something has happened that impacts them and the organization they work for, and nobody had the idea to communicate to the employee before there was an outreach implemented as far as external communication with media representatives is concerned, or other parties. So that's something that's very important. Again, it goes back to employee trust. The trust is definitely something that we want to protect, and we do want to make sure that employees understand that they are a part of the solution. So empowering them to work alongside senior management and as a team, the entire organization, in order to overcome whatever the challenges may be, that's really important. Now, obviously, the messaging then needs to be consistent and coherent, needs to be well coordinated on the internal end of things. And that's how you can turn employees into advocates, into communication allies, if you will. And that is always a dialogue that's ongoing. So it's not like you start that and then the crisis looks better the next day and now you can abandon that trajectory and just stop communicating. No, you really should go on communicating and have that process continue into the so-called post-crisis phase. That's very important. You should look into proven communication channels for that. So if you have communication channels in place that have worked in the past, then definitely tap into that. Try to be creative and add to the list of existing communication channels that can be crisis specific. So the better you can manage to reach out to employees, the more beneficial it's going to be. And when I talked about feedback options earlier, that is obviously a very good way to address employee questions and concerns, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. In order to preserve trust, in order to preserve reputation, you do need to allow stakeholders across the board to get back to you with questions and voice their concerns. How else are you going to become aware of what's on their minds and how you can help them, how you can help others out there? Because oftentimes it's employees telling you what's happening outside of the organization. So we may not be aware of it, but employees live in the community and there are concerns within the community, and the people who can tell the organizational leaders about what's happening, grapevine, if you will, within the community is actually through employees. And that's something that a lot of organizations sometimes neglect or don't have as much a focus on as they probably should be having.
Wonderful. We have a question regarding that. So how do you analyze the effectiveness of your message, both internal and externally with stakeholders? And then we know that poor messaging can be catastrophic, but are there any signs or consequences of your messages that signifies it was appropriate in situations or not appropriate, such as severe as evacuation?
Right. So on the employee side, it's actually oftentimes fairly easy. You can build into your communication, your outgoing communication, an invitation to provide feedback. And that is often a huge difference maker when you ask them, here's how you can get back to us with questions, here's how you can voice concerns, and then make it as easy as possible to reach back out to you, the sender of the message, and the whoever manages the communication, as well as the senior management within that particular organizational apparatus. And that's how you can, by inviting people to provide feedback, have a lot of input that can be extremely helpful. In addition to that, I mentioned it earlier, we'll want to have feedback options from a tech perspective, as well as from a communication channel perspective. So establishing that 1-800 number that employees can call, or an email account that, for instance, anonymously collects input coming from various employees and then feeds it to those who have to be involved in addressing these concerns. Let's just say it's concerns that are being communicated. That's really critical. Yeah. And how can we tell whether communication, that was the other component of that question, how can we tell that communication was successful? Well, in most cases, I heard you say, Liz, evacuation, for instance. Well, we can tell because we will obviously monitor what those who have received the communication are now doing. So we're talking to clients across the board about how can they find out whether this resonated with the audience, with the internal stakeholder group, in that case, employees. And that's where it's actually easier compared to external stakeholders, because external stakeholders may be anywhere, and you don't have any knowledge of where they may be physically, for instance. You may not know how to reach them. With employees, that's all easier, should be at least. No? So you can watch what are they now doing now that they have received the communication, and keep a very, very close eye on that. And as you monitor what's happening, you can certainly also talk to them, do follow-ups, do communication after the initial round of communication, whichever tool you may have used there, and actually tap into that group of employees, internal stakeholders, and ask questions. I mean, we've worked with senior leaders who, after major things had been announced within the organization, actually walk the walk and talk the talk, as in they went into the office space and spoke to individual employees or did follow-up calls to folks that were maybe a little bit lower on the organizational hierarchy, and then said to those direct supervisors, I want you to go into your team meeting, and the first question you should ask is, hey guys, did you understand what was communicated earlier today? And if it's a crisis situation where time is of the essence, it's the same formula. Yeah? Reach out to those who now need to make decisions based on the information that they have received, and understand if there are any concerns left, if there is anything unclear, and then clarify that and see to it that it's as transparent as possible, and that at the end of the day, everybody does what they hopefully will do because they have to do it, whether it's an evacuation, sheltering in place, they need to be safe, and that can easily extend it into external stakeholder groups as well. The communication may be a little different. Again, you may not know where exactly they're located at any point in time, but that's sort of the bottom line.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and if I could
Thank
just
you.
add, I was just going to go ahead and add. So for feedback, at least in emergency management and speaking to the public, the easiest way to get feedback on your message to the public is, what did the public do? If you sent out an evacuation and nobody listened to it, or if you sent out an evacuation and everybody listened to it, or your message wasn't received. We're seeing that a ton with COVID, right? People wearing masks, people not wearing masks. If people aren't doing what you're asking them to do, there's probably either an issue with your message or your message delivery, or the way that you're toning it. And so I always like to remind people that it's kind of easy to blame people to not listen to us, but we really need to assess our methods on how we're actually crafting the message, how we're delivering the message, and if they're getting that. And that's especially important even with wildfire evacuations, where there have been cases where people have never received an evacuation message to leave. So we can't be mad at them, and other incidences. And so take a step back after an incident and look at that. Another great tool too is social media for that, which we're going to get into a little bit, but social media is a two-way street. It gives us the ability to pump a message out to the public from the government, but also have the public do exactly what Oliver said and give us feedback. So if you put out a message, what is the public commenting? What's their perception of your message? What's their mood about your message? Are they understanding your message? Are they not? You can use social media to look at tweets and look at posts based on the incident. What are people saying? Are there a ton of rumors? Are some things in the science of COVID or the science of hurricane forecasting, are those things being misconstrued? Are people not understanding? So I think really engaging and looking at how people talk about your incident, how people are taking action, and then correcting your information in the incident is really important to try to get people to do what you want to do.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. So Ashley, if you just want to tell us a little bit more about social media and how it can be beneficial, and then the challenges that it presents as well.
Yeah, so I'm really passionate about social media. Some of you guys on here might know me on social media, so I'm happy to be able to talk to you on here. But really, honestly, for the past decade, like, social media has turned into one of the primary ways that people receive media and information. For me, I've had no cable, or I've cut the cord with cable 3 or 4 years ago. And so I'm not watching the news to get my information anymore. I'm not really using radio or anything else. And so people really do expect to receive a lot of their information from the government or from anything on social media. So having a presence with that is really important nowadays. It's also really important to be able to deliver your message on time and whenever you need to deliver it. That's another reason social media is really beneficial, because it's always there. It's a 24-hour platform instead of the 5 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news, 10 o'clock news. And then really, I'm a really big advocate for social media and public safety because of the points that I was just making with the two-way street of communication. No other platforms give you an ability to have people actually respond back to you and actually give insight and deliver information to you. So not only is it beneficial to put your message out there to social media for them to receive it, but they're also going to deliver you information about what they're going through, what impacts they are seeing, how they're understanding things. And that's where we can get into talking the virtual operations support team, or the VOST, if you're familiar about that. The act of actually going onto social media platforms and conducting social listening, where you're looking and reading what tweets are saying. You're trying to find storm reports, damage reports. You're actually collecting information, vetting it, because we know that social media isn't always correct, and then producing that into intelligence, which from an emergency management perspective, it's valuable when you're in an EOC with no windows to know what your jurisdiction looks like after that tornado or while the storm is ongoing. And I've been able to use social media to actually pinpoint damage while the damage was occurring, and then actually call my damage assessment teams and let them know, hey, this neighborhood already has damage from this storm. Let's start planning this stuff. Let's start getting stuff rolling. So really, social media is just so valuable. It's an expectation now. People expect for you to put that out there as an agency. And also, we can get benefit in operations if we harness the power of community reporting.
Definitely, yes, that's very interesting. So I assume there's a lot of pre-incident work that goes into using social media to make sure your message can get out there when it's needed. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so there is a lot of work to do in social media. And if you're kind of considering going that route, starting from the ground up, the first thing is to kind of figure out what your community uses, right? So it's just like messaging before. If you have a certain population that everyone uses Facebook, well, then I'm going to definitely want to have an agency Facebook to try to deliver my message to the most people, right? I don't want to have Snapchat if my population doesn't use Snapchat. So it's really great to kind of get some intelligence on what's being used, what's popular, and then also have several different ones, because just like Elizabeth and Oliver here, we all use different social media. Maybe I use Instagram, but maybe she likes Snapchat. And so having a handful of very popular platforms also will give you an ability to reach more people. But it's important to do an assessment like that. And then as you start to build up your social media presence, you want to kind of coordinate how you're putting messages out. Unfortunately, with social media like Facebook, if you do not put out messages timely or at a certain rate, the algorithm will actually bump your posts off people's feeds. So you need to figure out a way to have content when there's not disasters. That might look like outreach materials, National Preparedness Month, different kind of campaigns that we try to do to get engagement. Also working with your PIO and working with your agencies and kind of making some social media policies, having some ideas of the information that you're going to want to actually put out there to use that. And then also understanding who is the leading agency on social media for certain incidents, just like we kind of talked about previously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Those are some somewhat easy steps to get started there. Okay, we have another question from the audience. Should you change your messaging strategy or message delivery strategy if people are not listening to it? Is it ever too late to change your messaging strategy or delivery? That either of you can respond.
Yeah,
So
you go ahead, Ashley.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you. So I would say it's never too late to change, but keep in mind that, like we said earlier, trust is important. And we kind of saw this a little bit with COVID. So if you put something out like, masks don't work, and then you switch it and say masks work, you're going to get a little bit of pushback on that. And it's going to be very hard to reestablish some of the trust, because people are going to say, well, you told me earlier, or, you're changing the message now, so how do I know you're right? So definitely, I think that you can correct your message and you can come up with better strategy but that's why when you're delivering the message initially, you want to really try to be as accurate as possible and put out the right information at the right time. You don't want to be like overzealous and deliver this information that might not be right, if that makes any sense. But with COVID, I think that as we see how people react, we have been tweaking messaging. And I've been doing some social media messaging since March or April when I started. And my tactics now to try to get people to do the stuff we want them to do is a lot different based on what I saw them do over the summer or during holidays, or my observations when I go to the store and I hear people talking about it. So I think there are ways you can craft it to not lose that trust. Just be careful when you're making really hard switches on the content of your message about the trust factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I might want to add that, and this is something that was already mentioned before, that for any changes that you make, you need to be as best informed regarding what your audience, what your stakeholders are up to, what their thought process is, what they're thinking as possible. And that means you do have to actually mention it specifically, you do have to monitor. If you're not aware of what's going on the different channels, whether it's Twitter, you name it, Facebook, Instagram, then you will not be able to make good decisions. And the monitoring is a key piece. That is an area of significantly as far as my company is concerned, to the point that we do this for clients, not only regarding potential crises or active crisis situations, but we do it for competitive analysis, for instance, for identifying opportunities on the business side, whether it's on the marketing end of things and so forth. So it's certainly an area that precedes the crisis management or crisis response, which we often refer to as issues management. That's something where this monitoring comes into play, and you do need to do a thorough job there in order to be as intelligent in your response as ever possible. And one other thing we've worked, and that includes municipalities. These days, smaller ones, particularly, we've run into situations where we were told, well, can you please come in and help us with this? And we would like for you to take care of Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, all these different channels. And then as a consultant, you come in and you ask them, well, where are the accounts? Can you show us what you've been getting so far? And then you hear, well, we don't have that account. We've never had it. And that's obviously problematic, because if you do not yet have an established account, you do not have what you would refer to as followers or fans or whatever, depending on the tool. And if you don't have that following yet, then it's difficult to establish that in times of an actual crisis. You want to do that long before. Get started now, literally. Yeah. Because if push comes to shove and you don't have anything prepared, and you don't have the personnel, the technology, whatever it may be, then you run into a big problem. And that's something that certainly larger municipalities, larger companies, that problem does no longer apply. However, we run into these types of situations even in the year 2020. You know?
All right, so we're going to open it up to some more questions. So if anyone has a question, please put it in the comments. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll give you guys time to respond. All right, we got to thank you for the question, or the answer to the question. Give it another minute, but in the meantime, what would you guys recommend as immediate action to kind of take some actionable items from today and make some changes?
Do you want to speak to this first, Ashley, or shall I? Go ahead.
Sure, I can start. So I think to take any action, it kind of depends on what your communication already looks like. If you're starting from the ground up, maybe doing some work with your PIO, with your departments on information. Definitely assessing how you're doing COVID messaging would probably be good, because like we mentioned, doing AARs or after action reviews on the success of your messaging, what's working, what's not working, doing all of that. So take a look at how you've been messaging severe weather, COVID over the past 6 months. Look at how well it's been received. Look at your media interactions. Look at the coverage. If you feel like maybe you're not being covered during certain incidences and disasters, and that's something that you want to have, maybe consider establishing some relationships with media. So I think just taking a step back, looking at those plans and kind of doing what we've been saying the whole time, kind of envisioning what successful communication would look like for your agency, start planning and getting everyone in the room. And while you're doing those plans, take all the after action points from COVID and everything and make your communication better through that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to add that. Oh, go ahead.
Oliver, we'll come back to you. I just want to get Laura's question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with popular unofficial media accounts spreading misinformation? I can certainly relate to this one.
Yeah, good question. So we have a lot of conversations with clients regarding their terms used such as trolled, social media trolling. By and large, and we've actually developed a response procedure, we including a visual, which I don't have available now to walk people through. But by and large, you do want to be very careful when you respond to any negative content on social media. Typically, we advise clients to keep it limited in terms of a response, should you decide to respond at all, to keep that response limited to the particular social media channel that was used to level an accusation or come out with specific criticism. So that's critical. And misinformation, if you can, certainly do correct it. We all know that Facebook, Twitter, and so forth have, in the not too distant past, come out with certain mechanisms whereby they flag information that's inaccurate, and they have established more stricter, I guess you could say, procedures and try to manage the reality of misinformation being communicated to a degree that it's very, very hard to eradicate it, period. That's just not going to be possible. But you should really pick your poison there. You should see to it that you get to the bottom of the most egregious misinformation that's out there, and certainly identify in particular stuff that could put people in harm's way. So if I find information out there that can impact people's safety, then I need to put that at the very top of my priority list in terms of dealing with this, right? There may be whatever else out there where people get disparaged, whole 9 yards, but as soon as you identify the safety of any number of individuals, whether that's in your community or beyond, is in danger, then that needs to trigger an immediate response. And Ashley would go to work with her colleagues and identify the misinformation and try to correct it as quickly as possible. And it all goes back. Ashley mentioned it several times. If the audience, the stakeholders, the people within the community, or from a corporate perspective, customers, clients, and so forth, if they trust you, then you have a much higher chance of having your messaging resonate with this particular audience. So establish the trust early on, prepare upfront, write these plans long before something happens, assign tasks, responsibilities, and when it comes to plans as well as training, be vigilant. We review plans all the time. And unfortunately, we hear, we had a plan put together, and then you ask, well, when did that happen? And it's like 10 years ago. Well, I can guarantee you that plan is definitely outdated. So you need to revisit the plans. And if you tell me that the last training you did in terms of media skills, in terms of crisis communication, happened 5 years ago, well, then I'm going to have to tell you that that's not sufficient. You should look into doing this on a more regular basis, because recurring training is very, very important. It goes back to the pillars. Liz, your first question for me was, well, what goes into these things? And if you do not, on a recurring basis, train people and update, revisit existing plans for social media included, then that's not putting you in a good situation to the storm, so to speak.
Yeah, and then if I could just add, I know we're almost out of time, but to emphasize on the point that being in PIO and doing information is more than delivering the information, we should be listening, right? So to solve some of these problems with misinformation, especially from these accounts, you have to be monitoring certain accounts, monitoring the media, and also making sure that your message is being displayed or said correctly, right? And you have to make that correction. And interestingly enough, we actually had somebody do that, or not we, but one of those pages did that today and tried to claim that the governor of Maryland issued phase 1, which he did not. And the governor PIO actually tweeted, "Hi there, this is false, not sure where you got this information from." And so that's proof that their PIO is looking for tweets that are spreading rumors on stage 1 closures and everything that has to do with COVID. So keep in mind that once you push out a message, your job isn't done. You have to keep listening and correcting any rumors or anything else that comes up. But that's all I have.
Yeah. And COVID is really challenging for just any entity out there. Ashley was just talking about the side of government, if you will, whether it's a smaller municipality, a large city, or even a state, even countrywide. But that is no different. I can guarantee you, it's no different for any nonprofit organization out there, for-profit organization. COVID is something that needs to be really thought through in terms of the messaging, in terms of how can we reach our employees as well as external stakeholders, and be mindful of the fact that you always want to be careful, and that's something that Ashley mentioned earlier. If you make a directional change 180 degrees, that's probably going to confuse people out there. So always have when you communicate, have language included that based upon the facts as we see them right now, the information that we have leads us to believe, and then this is the recommendations that we have and so forth. So put it into context. That's kind of what it boils down to. You know?
Great. Well, this has been a great session. Thank you all for your help on this. I like the back and forth discussion here. On the screen, I have their contact information. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any additional questions to continue this learning environment here. We'll be hopefully coordinating the next few sessions in the next few weeks and be sending out information if you're interested in joining future ones. And again, feel free to reach out to me with any suggestions on topics if you're interested in being a speaker or anything like that. With that, I think we're going to end it. Thank you, Ashley and Oliver, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you
very much.
having me.
Have a good day, everyone.
You too. Bye.